Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steph and I'm from Road to Geek. Thanks for joining us on our webinar with a very appropriate name for today, A Horror Story, Workforce Management Implementations Gone Wrong. We've got a brilliant lineup of speakers from different verticals and job functions who'll be sharing their amalgamated experiences of workforce management implementations that have turned into nightmares. Very exciting. We'll also be turning these horror stories into fairy tales and providing some tangible advice for you to take away and apply to any workforce management project that you might be embarking on at the moment. So a bit of housekeeping. The webinar is scheduled for about an hour. We plan on the discussion taking roughly 45 minutes today, leaving us with 15 minutes for questions at the end. There is a Q&A function on Zoom, so hopefully you should all be able to see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please do ask questions as we go, and we'll either answer them throughout this session where appropriate, or we'll pick them up at the end. We won't read any names or companies out, and I think there is an option to ask questions anonymously, so feel free to ask any questions that you like. And if we don't manage to answer all your questions today, we'll respond on email after the webinar. This session is also being recorded and we'll send out to your emails that you've registered with, so don't worry about making too many notes today. So let's get started. I'm not actually your host for today, so I'll pass you over to Dave to get the discussion going and for introductions.
Thank you, Steph. So welcome everyone to A Horror Story. So workforce implementations gone wrong. Briefly, I'm going to do a quick intro on me and then introduce our three panelists for the day. So my name is Dave Abbott. I'm the Technical Director at TPP Retail. And I'm a long-term friend of Road to Geek, so I have worked with the team at Road to Geek for over a decade with various roles. Prior to being at TPP, I was at Morley's department store, so I was the retailer side for many a year, and prior to that at June London for even more years. So looking at everything from footfall projects to a workforce management project in both of those with Road to Geek, so probably a little bit biased. So that's a little bit about me, and then to introduce my panel. So first, Sarah, I'll let you do your own.
Oh, so hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I've worked across retail for most of my career, done a plethora of roles, and have worked on multiple workforce management projects with multiple different workforce management providers.
Thank you, Sarah. And yourself, Jade?
Hi, I'm Jade Colazzo. I'm HR Director for Cleanology, a national commercial cleaning company. I deal with all things people related, including HR, training, payroll, etc. I've been with the company for 15 years and we've experienced quite a bit of growth over the years, scaling from 100 to over 1,000 employees. So there's been a number of workforce management implementation projects during that time. So I've had quite a bit of experience with it.
And finally, yourself, Tom.
Hi guys, Tom Yellowlees here. Happy Halloween. My name's Tom. I'm the lead implementation manager currently at Road to Geek. I've had around 10 or so, probably over now, 10 years experience within tech startup scale-up companies, focusing on implementation specific roles across a number of different sectors like hospitality, beauty and wellness, and retail. So nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Tom. So the structure of the webinar is we thought we'd split it into 6 sections or 6 haunted rooms in our haunted house. So behind each of those doors will hopefully be some horror stories and also some sweet treats on what has gone well in your implementations in workforce management. So looking at evaluating suppliers, how ready your business was, how the kickoff and discovery went, how build and test phases were delivered, training and development, and finally, and all important, that BAU. So we have got a Q&A, like Steph says. If you have questions as we go, please pop them in the Q&A. We'll try to get them as we talk. And then the first door then is jumping into that evaluating supplier. So first up, Sarah, I guess, you're going through a selection process. At what point with your selection process of a supplier do you start talking about implementation?
So for me, I think you need to talk about this early because it needs to form part of your pricing, so that you definitely know what cost you're signing up to and what commitment you need on your side versus what you're outsourcing. So I think it's you've got to obviously do the functionality first because there's almost not too much value in talking about implementation if it's not a solution you're going to be happy with. But I think not focusing on the implementation at that selection stage can really lead to some mismanaged expectations around
So
who's
key,
going
isn't
to
it?
do what.
Yeah, really important. And early on, I think, because it's
Yeah.
sort of, key on getting it live at that endpoint as well. Even when you're looking at supply and how mature they are in their implementation process is quite important sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's like, who do you want to create the training? Is that going to be done supplier side? Are you going to do that in-house? All of those things for me factor into that implementation discussion, because I think it does lead to that. What's the resource makeup that you need to successfully implement and deliver the project, and where is that resource coming from, and where does that skill come from, I guess, ultimately.
Yeah, for sure. And Jade, how about yourself? So as part of that project scope, there'll be key KPIs, business goals, objectives. Do you share them with the supplier? How does that work?
Yeah, definitely. As a business, the people aspect is one of our 4 pillars. So it's quite important to us, and we have maybe some initiatives that we've implemented that have positive impact on our staff and maybe quite unique or specific to us. So as a result, we've always been very specific with our suppliers about things that, things that we absolutely have to have, or things that we really don't want. So kind of red lines and things that, yeah, we just can't kind of budge on. So I think when it comes to dealing with suppliers, you have to be really upfront with them and say, this is an absolute no, this is an absolute yes, and share that with them. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble with the implementation from the get-go.
Oh yeah, without much doubt. And yourself, Tom, so I guess slightly a different perspective from being a supplier and being in that implementation team. Any tips at that stage when you're even evaluating the supplier that you should be considering from a retailer?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can resonate with the comments that Sarah's made. The product's functionality's got to fit for your business, right? So that's got to be the gatekeeper. But understanding the supplier, what experience they have within the vertical that your business actually operates in is a really good insight to have on the supplier that you're choosing. Can they actually relate to the world that you live in, and therefore adapt and tailor the configuration of the platform to see you fit? I think also probing the supplier on their implementation process or approach at the relevant stage, and any material they can share in advance of that to give you good confidence that they've got their ducks in a row and they're a super organized unit, I think is a good point for me.
Definitely. I guess we have to answer that question about horror stories at evaluating supplier stage. Does anyone have any horror stories? Ooh.
So I think my probably horror story, and I won't give the specifics, is around over promising and then being disappointed when you get to implementation. So I think I definitely one for like really doing your research and validating anything you're told is a fact. I think also really good to talk to other customers of both that supplier to see what their experience has been, both just from a kind of watch outs and any tips that they can share, because they've done it and you haven't yet, potentially.
There's usually only a couple of degrees of separation to someone you know in your network that has some relationship with them, I've always found, which is always quite interesting, isn't there, Sarah? So yeah. How about yourself, Jade? Any horror stories at implementation phase that selecting supplier?
Definitely along the way, we've definitely had some. I think the suppliers that have been better in their explanation and delivery of the kind of the KPIs and objectives that we were talking about, you notice the difference. The ones who've been very forthcoming and open and have given demonstrations, access to the system before you kind of sign up, testimonials, and kind of have given guidance on how that implementation should look, have definitely been the ones that you, as a business, you'd recommend without hesitation. And the horror stories is just essentially the opposite of that. Things that you are positive was put in writing or kind of signed off as absolutely available, and at a later date you might find it's been removed from functionality or is perhaps not exactly what was sold to you. So I'd say that's probably the toughest situations we've had.
Yeah, interesting. Yourself, Tom? Anything horror stories at that early stage?
Yeah, I think bad experiences have been where the sales team haven't got full alignment with the implementation team, and there's a different picture being painted to the customer, versus what we actually need to implement. So it's trying to get alignment there has caused some chaos. And I think that in itself is something to really bear in mind. But I think and we get onto this point about actively listening. I think we want to make sure we have a picture of what we think good looks like for a particular customer as a supplier, but open your eyes and open your ears to make sure you're listening to what their problems actually are, and don't be boxed in to a certain approach for delivery if it's not going to suit customer. So I think being flexible at all points throughout the implementation is key, and you've got to listen and you've got to understand what problem are you trying to fix at the start of the project to make that a success. So I think the flexibility part and being adaptable and nimble at the appropriate time is a good option. So as Jade's mentioned, when that doesn't happen, you get into some tough conversations right from the word go.
Yeah, for sure. My worst one was a footfall provider implementation where actually you had 3 people at this early stage, and one of them, who was the incumbent, was just like, tell us what you want to do. And it's like, well, you're the expert in footfall counting. You should be telling me what's on your roadmap. So that was, and they don't exist anymore, so I won't name them, but that was one from back in the day, which made me laugh. And funny enough, I didn't win the tender at that point. But so moving swiftly on to our second room. So business readiness. So you've selected a provider, and it's time to get your business ready for the change element. Sarah, how important is that communication and change management? Sounds like a silly question, I think, really, but let's go into detail.
Yeah, so I think it's so important, and just don't underestimate the power of that communication and its importance, because I think people fill the void if you don't fill it for them. And actually, they definitely get to horror stories in their heads around what you're doing or why you're doing it, particularly with workforce management solutions, because it impacts schedules and pay. It's really emotive for colleagues anyway. And so they often bring anxiousness to it. So I think it's that, talk about it early, and be okay with talking about it at a high level and getting into the detail as you get closer. I think which can be uncomfortable when you're in a project team, because you're like, I don't want to be held to something. What if something goes wrong later on, or we have to delay? And I think it's being okay with, this is our intention, and the timeline might move, or exactly how we do it might evolve, but this is our intention, and doing that. And then I think the other thing is just being really overt in what are the benefits for all of your different audiences, because it can be a tendency. You worked, by the time you selected your supplier and got your business case across the line, you're so focused on what's the value to the business, because that's how you secured your funding, that it can be a really easy miss to go, but here's what it actually means for colleagues. In terms of solving the problems that they're seeing. So I think, really tailoring that comms and having two-way communication for me as well is super critical. So like allowing colleagues to ask questions, raise any concerns, and really listening so that you are adapting your approach based on what they're telling you.
Especially with workforce management, you don't want it to be that surprise for those colleagues at some point down the line, do you? So that's really like, so I think you don't want it to be a surprise. And I think my other learning from some past experiences is, don't think of it as just a system implementation. It's actually a people change that you're delivering via a system. And that's I think, like you say, when it's touching people's pay packets and their shift patterns, and it is very emotive for workforce management, isn't it? It's slightly different to some other retail change projects that we can be landing, but actually that workforce management piece is really key. And how about yourself, Jay? So when you're talking to project sponsors and project teams, how do you go about that, at that kind of business readiness phase of a project?
We more recently, our most recent workforce management implementation, we've done it a few times. We definitely took some lessons learned from previous situations, and we were quite robust about how we approached that, both for ourselves and for our suppliers. So we, created a document with roles and responsibilities very clearly defined. Even things that seemed a little obvious, we put it all down in writing just to keep ourselves centered and focused on what the goals were. And as I mentioned before, the good suppliers are the ones who support you with that and make suggestions about how you prepare for that and what you can expect from it. We have worked with, Halloween pun incoming, we have worked with a scary number of suppliers who have not suggested any of those things and have maybe set expectations, but have not kind of given you any idea over what you can expect in terms of time, how many people you might need related to it, how much information do they need from us to be able to get the system live, etc. So very important to kind of define those responsibilities, but also in conjunction with the supplier, I would say.
Yeah, so key. And then that leads really nicely onto Tom, I guess, and a conversation you and I were having last week, Tom, about stakeholder alignment as well, this business readiness phase. So how do you see that from a implementer side of it, getting those stakeholders lined up from an early stage?
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. And you'd hope with a good supplier that they come proactively to the table with suggestions as to what the people that we need in the room at the start of the project. And that's absolutely crucial. We don't want decisions to be made or curveballs to arrive midway through the project, which is going to affect the delivery or the full deployment of the platform at the end of the project. So it's just trying to get everyone aligned in the room at the start of the project to be absolutely clear on the requirements that are needed for delivery. And we've got the powers that be that can make decisions at that point. I think also with regards to once the implementation is actually up and running, it's making sure that those project stakeholders that you've got in the room at the start are kept up to date and there's visibility there throughout kind of the key milestones of that project, particularly if you hit any challenges or unexpected issues. You want to keep that visibility throughout, proactively resolve those risks against the delivery. And the team that you've got at the customer side is crucial for that. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
And how do you lead that frequency, Tom? So I guess when you're talking about stakeholder engagement, so are you often leading the frequency? Do you let the customer lead a little bit? How does that work?
I think you absolutely want to take lead there. We're the specialists as a supplier for getting their system up and running. So we need to take the front step there, obviously open to flexibility as to when those key touch points would be. And you potentially look at a weekly sync for the core project team, but at every key stage, which is what we're kind of walking through today, you want to be keeping the likes of your project sponsor and those that hold the purse strings really clear as to how you're tracking against the projects itself and whether you've hit any delays along the way. And that visibility will then dampen any noise that potentially could happen throughout the project. So I can't stress enough how and where we've been stung before is where we haven't had that some of those key stakeholders in the room at the start, and that's caused unnecessary stress and pain along the way. So yeah.
And I guess any horror stories again at business readiness, has the business readiness disappeared like a ghost at any point during your project?
Well, I think I've got a number of examples there from a horror story perspective, but massive changes in scope midway through the implementation and an assumption from the customer that this wouldn't cost them anything and that they would stick to the same timeline. So already you're on the back foot. That could have been alleviated right at the start of the project to get everyone on the same page, because I think what can happen is that the supplier will make an assumption, which they shouldn't, that everyone that is in the room is aware of the project that's going on, but that isn't always necessarily the case. So it's about reconfirming, validating that you've got a clear picture of personnel, is everyone in the loop that needs to be, and that would hopefully eradicate that sort of issue from happening, because it will have a massive ramifications onto the delivery of the project.
And Sarah Jade, any horror stories of business readiness? Any bits that have gone wrong?
So I think I probably come at it more from an end user perspective. So I completely agree with everything Tom said about like your senior stakeholders, but I think sometimes that being very last minute with your comms, which is, hey, here's this thing that's coming and it goes live tomorrow, and by the way, here's everything you've got to do, is not the right onboarding experience for colleagues. And I think sometimes, particularly if a project's had delays, we could all be guilty of going, well, we've just got to hit a date. So like, and rushing that engagement piece absolutely always bites you. It might seem like the right thing to do, but I think if you don't nail that engagement piece and take your colleagues with you, particularly if they've got to, you know, as you say, it's a really emotive one, workforce management, because if someone doesn't know, hasn't done the training, and then people are worried they're not going to get paid, or worst case scenario, there are mistakes in payroll, that's a terrible place to be in, and really, really tough to recover from. So I think that, you know, making sure you are really clear on what is your implementation plan, and almost holding firm on that, no matter how far to the right every other date has moved, that the implementation can't just move to the left to recover everything. I think it is probably my one where I think there's always some interesting, healthy conflict between stakeholders sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure it's definitely. And Jade, have you got any horror stories at that early stage for business readiness?
Probably joining a project kickoff meeting where the supplier didn't know our names or what company we were.
Very good. That's a good horror story. Wow. Yeah. How to make first impressions. There's a book on that, I think, somewhere, isn't there? But yeah, wow, that's a good one. And that leads us amazingly on to like that kickoff and discovery phase, I guess. So moving on to the kickoff discovery for yourself, Jade, how does that usually get driven? Is it yourself? Is it the supplier? What are the good? What are the bad? So obviously the bad, I think you just said of a kickoff where they're jumping on the call and they don't know who they're there with, which is a good one.
I think over communicating. The implementations that have gone really well have been where the communication has flowed, and it doesn't always have to be, you know, in a totally positive aspect. Sometimes there's pushback and there's questions about, you know, is this realistic? Perhaps the deadlines that you've sent are not manageable, and the quality that you're looking for might not be achievable in that timeline. So over communicating, absolutely. And when it's not been amazing, even if it's driven from the customer side, I don't think it's as effective. I think you really need that support from the supplier, because they're kind of the experts in it. They've done it as many times as you might have worked through implementations. The supplier for sure will have done it a lot more times. You kind of need that rapport with them, and the relationship, I think, for an effective implementation.
And that rapport is really important, I think, isn't it, Jade? Because there's so much a solution can do, but actually it's the people that are implementing it and the people your side and their side, which is half of what you're deciding in that early phase. So actually, again, that kick
Absolutely
is so key at that point. And I guess, Tom, from an implementation lead perspective, how should a supplier be communicating to a new customer at that point? I'm guessing it's know their names is number one by the sounds of it.
That's always a good start. There's a number of items that could sit within this sort of question, Dave, but we want to be honest and we want to be actively listening throughout the process. So, you know, ultimately the job of a supplier is to handhold the customer through the process. They're ultimately paying for that service to deliver their workforce management platform on time and in full. So we really want to make sure we're supporting them as much as we possibly can. And listening is the gatekeeper. We need to complete that or paint that picture from our side as to what problem are they trying to solve? What is the challenge that they've got within the business that by implementing this workforce management platform, it will resolve or it will improve? So again, that will then align back to their kind of key business objectives and obviously the project goals within implementation. I think at that point, I'd always, and especially within my team at the minute, is we want to challenge the customer a little bit on their current way of working, because in essence, they're moving to a new platform for a reason. What can we do at the same time to improve efficiencies or make things quicker? Because these are the sorts of benefits that will hopefully be communicated nice and early to the rest of their business in terms of change management, and building that excitement for the deployment of the platform. So I think it's good to challenge at the appropriate time and actually ask the question, why? Why are you doing that? What's the reason behind your process here? Can we look at it a slightly different way? So just opening the net.
Why is such an important question for some of these processes that have been around for decades, sometimes in some ways as well, isn't it? So it's like, why are you doing that? Why do you stick with that?
And a lot of it's ingrained for years, and getting them out of a habit that they've done for a long time is probably the biggest blocker sometimes when delivering a new workforce management platform. So how do we dig into that? Well, we need to connect with those end users, as Sarah's mentioned, and bring to light what are the benefits for them by implementing this. And it's not a position of what do you think? This is happening, but this is the reasons why it's happening. So it's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And then for Sarah and Jade, I guess the timelines for a project, getting them kind of established quite early on in that discovery phase, how crucial is that? And any horror stories of where it's gone wrong with those timelines and maybe missing them might be, I'm guessing, what's happened historically.
Yeah, I think setting the expectations has been has been really important. We've had situations before, which maybe not quite a horror story, but maybe a bit of a shocker for us, where even with a really good implementation, where we've been working well with the supplier, our expectations have maybe been totally misaligned. And then when we've kind of shared those timelines together, we've been on totally opposite pages. In this example, it turned out absolutely fine because we had a great relationship with the supplier and they were very frank with us, and it was all fine. But I suppose if you didn't have a good relationship with that supplier, it could have gone totally differently.
Yeah, and yourself, Sarah.
Yeah, so I think for me it's that having a plan but keeping a plan live. I've seen a few projects where we write the plan at the beginning and then we don't update it as things happen, and then you get to the end and you're surprised that your set in stone date has been missed, even though something took twice as long as it was actually planned to take. And I think my other probably horror story is be mindful of other change around you and other projects' timelines. So your project could be running exactly to plan, but if someone else's has run late, you might then be in huge conflict because you're pushing too much change to colleagues all at once, or through no fault of your own, your project might be deprioritized or delayed because the business make a decision that this other project's got to go first. And I think that be very focused on your project can be brilliant, but put your head up and just be mindful of what's happening around you. Definitely had some of those scenarios where I've had projects where you go, oh, we're all on track, but this other thing that wasn't known at the start of our project, particularly if you're doing long projects. I think sometimes the world changes. If you have a project that's going to span 18 months, the view of the world at the start of the project is often different to the view of the world at the end of the project. And so just sanity checking what's going on around you is definitely one that's caught me out in the past.
Definitely. And then I guess, Tom, from your side with the timescales perspective, what are some good examples and some less good examples from customers that you see, I guess? How does it go well and how does it go badly?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really tough balance that you've got to play, because you'll have a customer keen as mustard, for instance, that wants to get the product live yesterday. And you've got to weigh that up with what's realistically achievable from both sides, because there's always an element of the customer meeting the supplier halfway. And that comes down to a lot of the data requirements that a lot of workforce management providers and any other providers, really, when it comes to implementation, there needs to be elements that need to be completed from the customer side. So trying to get clarity and visibility and communicate that as early as you possibly can in the project, so that the customer's project team can get as organized as possible and set up the implementation for success. You'd like to hope that the process from sales through to implementation is smooth and the transition is smooth, so that you prepared them well for that. But I think the horror stories come when they haven't been given that insight, and you're left in a difficult position to try and tell some bad news to a customer on a project timeline when that hasn't been aligned. So I think the whole process of preparing for implementation is actually teed up towards the end of the sales cycle as well. So it just need to be aligned within the teams of the supplier as well.
Definitely. And we've got our first question in, Tom, for you as well, which is exciting. There's now 3 all of a sudden, they'll come at once. A really interesting question, actually, one I've got some experience on, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective. How would you manage stakeholder turnover during the implementation? That's a real challenge as well.
Wow, that is massive. Yeah, and that is a big
question to start with, isn't it? That's
just cut your teeth in that one. It's a really good point, but I think to Sarah's point about getting your head above the parapet, you need to be aware of what else is going on within the customer's world. because there are a lot of dependencies that we'd hopefully try and flag at the start of the project. And a lot of that is, what else have you got on your plate? What other projects are running in tandem? Do we need to be aware of that? Does that impact the delivery of this particular project? So, you know, that's a good example of key personnel change. Okay, what's our plan to get back on track? Do we need to adjust timelines slightly off the back of that? Have we made everyone aware of that change and the knock-on effects of bringing them up to speed? So I think it's about having that open conversation, open communication between the supplier and the customer. But sometimes you need to probe and ask those questions, and don't assume that the customer's just going to tell you, because sometimes they won't. Sometimes they've got lots on their plate. So I think it's down to the savviness of your project lead or your implementation manager to make sure that they're just double checking at certain points of the project, because it will have a direct impact onto the delivery of that platform, particularly if it's someone that's left the business who's a pivotal role. Potentially they're one of the ambassadors, and they're heavily involved with the trainer schedule, for instance.
So I had a project sponsor leave one project, so not workforce management, actually the project sponsor left during a restructure, and actually getting a new project sponsor was a real struggle, because actually nobody then wanted that. So you're nearly about to go live with something, and it's all of a sudden it's like, You're going to say, Sarah? Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, and a real one for me is, I think if you're onboarding new people into projects, they're not always new people to the organisation. So we lazily make the assumption that they come with all the knowledge. And so I think a learning for me over the years, and I've definitely learned this one the hard way, is like always have an induction plan for people. If they're new into the business, you'd induct them into the business. But if they're new into the project, almost do them a project induction.
That's really good advice, isn't it? Yeah, an induction.
And I think like, it's so easy to miss when your internal teams change. You go, well, they're all internal, it's fine. They know what the company does. And that's true, but projects are a different monster, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Very good points. That's very good. And then our second question at the moment, any common warning signs that an implementation is going off track? Anything that's happened that one to watch out for?
I think telltale signs would be, a lack of communication or response, or you're not getting as much engagement to commit to certain weekly check-ins. Straight away, alarm bell should be going to say, hang on a second, in order for us to deliver by X date. But it's at that point, and it's getting the balance right as to when to escalate. But you need to keep that visible to all the key project stakeholders that are within the customer's team, because it might be a valid reason that someone's not getting back to you, or it might be a reason that you've not really thought of. So trying to get good collaboration amongst the project team to then keep you updated as to what the status is for the personnel, because you'll tend to play and work with some of the project team more than others, but there will be certain personnel that are looking after key elements of the build or test, for instance, that we need to make sure we've got good comms through. So I think that's some of the things that could help there.
Yeah, and I'd probably just build there as well. I think definitely when you're in that implementation phase, really listen to your end user. So I think it's really easy to be, particularly if this project's been your baby for a long while, you become really defensive of it and you start challenging people's feedback rather than accepting it at face value. And I think if the feedback comes, it isn't always solution driven. It might be, do you know what, you've missed a step in your training instructions, or you've used a word that just is not clicking with people, or something really simple. But that really listening to the feedback, and definitely one from lots of implementations, don't take silence as good news. If you're hearing nothing, get out there and find out.
You find out 60 days later, Sarah, that once you're live, and then it's sort of like, this button just doesn't work. And you're like, no. So halfway through, I guess, so moving into that full room of build and test. So we've done a discovery phase. We know what we're doing. We're to that kind of proof of concept or early rollout phase. Any key learnings around successful, or I guess equally unsuccessful, pilots and trials at that point from anyone?
So there's probably two key things for me that I think, again, align all your stakeholders both sides on what is your success criteria for your pilot, so that you don't get to the end and one of you thinks it's been a success and the other one thinks it's been a failure. And I think for me, I always try and pilot everything and not just the technical solution. I think far too often we go, well, just pilot the solution, but actually if you're piloting all of your comms and all of your training materials, you can come out of your pilot either really confident or honestly knowing you're not quite ready and you've got work to do. But if you are hand holding it through, that comfort that you think you've got from your pilot might not turn into a reality when you roll out. So I'm always a fan of piloting everything and not just the technical solution.
And I remember a younger me would have quite happily ran pilots without training guides, Sarah, actually, and then thought, actually, when we get to roll out, we'll have that full training guide done at that point. And you look, and actually, that is your opportunity to get the training guide done, to have it ready, and to get that feedback from those first store or couple of stores, if that goes that way.
Absolutely. Because you're so used to the solution by then, you've been through testing, you've been working on it for a year, you missed that critical step out of the training guides. There's actually nothing wrong with your solution, it's just a step missed out of the training instructions, but it can create so much noise and feedback and negativity that you have to then recover from. Whereas if you catch that in your pilot, it's much easier place to fix.
Yeah, and I think to second that, in terms of I'm a big fan of pilots. You've got a selected group of locations or a selected number of users. Take the opportunity to capture some of that feedback and put it into a positive spin. I think one of the challenges, if you do go for a full deployment, is there's a potential risk that it might not land in the way, or you might not have thought about something that does come to light within those pilot situations. So I think, from my eyes, definitely take the feedback, think about it. Can we make small amendments or tweaks or iron out any snags that we thought we'd eradicated, but they raised their ugly head again? So I think that would always be my port of call for pilots.
And Jay, yourself?
I'd say being able to use it with your own data, whether it be a sandbox account or an environment where it can kind of be wiped clean, but using your own information and data and being able to play with it in a way that's not going to impact anything. It's not connected, it's not live, because it can be a lot easier to identify problems when you're looking at the sort of information that you're used to looking at. We found that it was a lot easier to identify problems or things that we needed to solve when we were using our own data. And debriefing, I think debriefing and keeping notes and saying what went well, what didn't go well, as both Sarah and Tom said, there might be things later on when you get to training that you don't remember from that situation. So if you're having those debriefs and what you're experiencing that moment could well be something that you need to really cover quite heavily in the training later on. So what they both said as well, I think is really important.
Those retrospectives are so important, Jade, aren't they? With as many people as you can to just what went well, what didn't quite land as you'd expect it to. Was that the goal of the pilot at that point? And did we hit those goals? And they can be really fast, actually. So you can be trying to do them quite quickly if you're doing different stages of a pilot. But if you just forget them, then all that knowledge that you gain as a pilot just goes out the window next week, doesn't it? Because people move on with their days as well. So no, really interesting. And any bad pilot phases, anything where it's got to pilot and failed entirely, you've had to bin it, anything like that at all? Sarah's yes. Sarah's like, yes, I had to bin many of them.
Yeah, so and I think sometimes that can be seen massively as failure, but actually if you've been really clear on your success criteria and you don't hit it, it's a good news story to tell end users. I think sometimes we're really afraid to say to them, hey, do you know what, we uncovered something in testing and it means it's not good enough for you, and so we're not going to deploy it. I never want to shy away from telling colleagues that we are delaying for the right reasons. I think, and if you do get to a pilot and you have to throw something away, really making sure you've done that retrospective, because things have gone wrong much earlier than your pilot to find yourself in that position. That's about you didn't get your requirements right. That's about people had misaligned scope expectations. or you have encountered where everyone signed everything off without reading it and then thought they can throw their feedback in at the 11th hour, my favorite. So I think, but it, you know, when they go wrong, they are a real opportunity to learn the lesson, and it might be a really painful and costly lesson, but even so, you could apply that to future projects.
And it could be less costly
recovering.
than rollout as well, isn't it? So actually, if you're failing at that pilot stage, that's the time to be failing and then recovering and changing.
And it's really powerful to take that feedback and then action it, and they can see that you've listened to them, and that they can see those tweaks or changes within the end product. I think the horror story is where you have the pilot, you've logged all these good bits of feedback, but then full deployment comes around, you do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, exactly, Tom.
And they see the same errors. So
people are rushing to hit a deadline. They're like, "We'll get back to it later." All those kind of things, and actually, you're just delivering a substandard solution at that point, aren't you? No, really good. Okay, moving into our penultimate door is that training and deployment phase. So we've kind of covered it a little bit, but I think those key experiences of training, admin users, new users, train the trainer, what are the good, what are the bad, and what are the ugly, I guess, in those worlds?
Yeah, so one I feel really strongly about, and I think it applies particularly in the workforce management spaces, I think it's a really rubbish experience for people if their first experience of a system is here's a load of admin to put all the users in. I absolutely hate that one. I think that's a horror story for me, and that's often a, you know, oh, we've tried to cut some cost or time or workload from a different team. I think that's an absolutely terrible introduction to something new. Like, oh, here's a bucket load of admin for you to do that we're going to dress up as training. But I think the being really clear on your user groups and what are those users going to do, and therefore what training do they need, but also making sure you're telling people who aren't part of that training. So if you're training someone's team, make sure their manager knows. And then I think the other one that is really tough, and is probably tougher in a post-COVID world, is that securing commitment to the time for training. Because we tend to go, oh, we've put it in an e-learning module and people can complete it in their own time.
Yes.
And you've given everyone 10 days to do it, and 10 days in, you've got 5% completion rate.
Yes.
Versus and I'm not, by the way, I'm not advocating for let's drive everyone into a classroom to complete e-learning, because that's a terrible experience as well. But I think that time blocking in people's diaries for them to complete training and securing that from your sponsors, that commitment, and line managers and all the way down the line, but likewise listening to the business. So maybe Mondays isn't the right day to run training, so keeping Mondays free, or avoiding, you know, my favorite is like, let's get invited to a training session at 4 o'clock on a Friday. That's definitely not going to set you up for success. So I think those things, and then I think try not to be one-dimensional in how you create training. People learn in different ways. So some people will want a user guide, others will want a video, some will just want to play with it and see if they can break it. And all of those experiences are relevant around how people learn. And so I think sometimes we can be a little bit too focused on, I'm going to do it this one way, and that might not work for all of your populations, particularly if you work in a business with a multi-generational, multi-skilled workforce.
Yeah, definitely. And Jade, how about yourself? Any of those good training things? Any horror stories from training?
Exactly what Sarah said, you know, providing those training materials in a variety of formats. You know, the implementations that have gone exceptionally well are when you've had written training, a user guide, a video, maybe some in person if that works well for people, and kind of mixing it up and keeping it exciting. I think the other thing is regular communication with the staff about all of that, you know, about the training that's upcoming, and keeping them in the loop with it, so that when it does come to training, they've got a good feel for the system, you know, and for the implementation, and they're excited about it. So yeah,
definitely. I think you said a really key word there, Jade, on making it exciting. I worked for a retailer many a year ago where I was managing quite large teams, and the manager above me was like, "Oh, the training, just get them to sit in the room and they can read that document. It'll be fine." I'm like, that is not what this brand was about. Like, this is like the worst way of delivering how to bring that product to life. And you just look back at it and you're like, it was just a tick box exercise of, oh, has Joe done the training? Yes, he sat there for 10 minutes and read that manual. So excellent, excellent. We can move on with our days. It's like, I've never disagreed with something so much. But from your side, Tom, from a supply perspective, what do clients need in order to successfully deliver that kind of training?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a number of really, really good points. And I would tend to look at the training element being prepared before the training happens. So you really want to try and drive to touch on the excitement piece, but the communications from the customer side to build that excitement and allowing the end user to understand, why is this platform coming? What are the key benefits for me? And really tap into their world, I think is a really good gatekeeper before the training actually happens. Because if you don't do that, suddenly they're faced with training and they have lots of questions and they don't know why they're doing this. You're faced with a pretty uphill battle. So trying to get those communications in as early as possible, and again, being as creative as you possibly can when the training actually comes along. Because as a supplier, it's virtually impossible to train everyone in the business for a new workforce management system. So how do we support the customer with a really robust train-the-trainer schedule, which aligns to availability? And we've got early heads up of when these training sessions would be. What will the training sessions be? Will it be a mixture of virtual, online, or will there be an element of face-to-face where it'll be a bit more of a workshop slant to it? So trying to find the best fit for the personnel that you've got in your business. And that's about the implementation manager, kind of asking those questions, but coming to the table with some ideas as to what's worked well with other customers and sharing back some of those stories, I think can be really, really powerful. It also kind of ties back in with our discussion around that pilot launch, because that feedback could actually then aid a better training solution or more robust schedule off the back of that, because they will pose you questions that you might not have thought about, and that can then help structure the training for the full deployment. So I think it's a kind of a mixture of those things in my eyes, Dave.
So I'm happy.
Definitely. And then moving on to our final rooms, we've only got about 10 minutes left. We're going to whiz through the final scary room in our horror house, and jump on some Q&A. So there's loads of questions flying in. So support providers and business as usual. Really open, Jay, Sarah. Any great experiences, any horror stories once you've gone live with a project?
Probably as a horror story, being moved across to live before we confirmed we were ready to move to live. I think the customer has to sign off on it too.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think for me, I'm going to call it a horror story, but I think we're often really guilty of not celebrating a successful implementation and the go live. And definitely the big miss that I see time and time again is we just don't thank people. So actually, even if something's gone super smoothly, for end users, change is disruptive, and just thanking them for participating, I think it is really critical. And so I sort of use it as a horror story, because I think there's nothing worse than like everyone's really invested and it's all gone really well, and then the sponsor doesn't even acknowledge that anything even happened at the end, and you go, like, just say thanks everyone, great job. I
makes a lot of difference. Those two words,
it's a really obvious
one,
but it gets missed loads of time.
Definitely. And then in 2 sentences, Tom, how about yourself? When do you hand off projects to BAU from your side? How's that seamless?
Yeah, I think there's a balance there depending on the complexity of that implementation. They'll move into a period of hypercare, usually from past experience, where they've gone fully live or fully deployed amongst the business, and hopefully we've had good alignment with the customer success team or the account managers that you've got assigned to that customer, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure they're seeing return on their investment. And that comes back down to, what were the business objectives that we'd set at the start of the project? And some of those will take quite a bit of time to come into fruition. So we want to keep really close with those customer success guys and allow them to then sort of create and improve that relationship with the customer as much as possible. But that needs to come with, good insights. How are they tracking against those business objectives? What other questions have been coming through as they move to the land of business as usual? So I think it's kind of a two-prong approach. We've got first line or second line support, where customers might be coming in with ad hoc questions throughout, but making sure that those account managers and customer success managers are aligned with those questions, and they can lead that into positive conversations with their kind of key stakeholders at the appropriate time. So, a regular cadence of business review meetings, quarterly or 6 monthly, but bringing active data insights to those meetings is crucial, because if you don't have that, then what are you measuring success against when it comes to those business objectives? You won't have anything to talk about. So I think returning investment for a customer is one of if not the biggest thing that we need to make sure we're delivering on, and they will hold you to account.
Yeah, definitely.
And you need to be aware of that and make sure that's front and center of everything that you're doing in order to support, because they won't stay in implementation forever, ideally not. So
Yes.
we want to try and get them through
Yeah.
that process as efficiently and as engaged as possible, to hand a customer to a customer success manager who is already aware of what's been happening with the challenges or how that project's gone. So again, it comes back to that sort of seamless transition for the customer if they are handed. And again, it's about trying to manage expectations and the communications threads for the customer. Who do they need to go to get certain questions answered? At what point are we handing over the project? And what's worked really well in previous experience is having that project debrief, where you can tap into what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, get some closure on that project, allow you to communicate to the customer. All right, from now on, you're in the very capable hands of the customer success manager, and just pass that baton on in a really, really effective way.
Thank you, Tom. And so that's the end of our horror haunted house. So we've got just over 5 minutes for some Q&A, so we'll dive into those in 1 second. I will always have a quick think as well about your one takeaway from the best implementations, which we'll finish on in a minute as well. So from questions, I'm going to go straight to you, Sarah. I think there's an interesting one here that says suppliers on the most part would always try to steer clear of doing pilots. Is a pilot always necessary?
So I think, is it always necessary? No. I mean, it's always my preference. I'll be honest, that's a personal preference born out of experience. I think it comes back to if it's a showstopper for you as when you're selecting the vendor, be really clear on that. And if they say they won't do it, then they're probably not the right vendor for you.
I've not come across many that don't say they do a pilot as well. Like, free proof of concepts are pretty hard to come across nowadays, understandably, but pilots are generally part of it, I would say.
So pilot is it's a form of business readiness go live check for me.
Yeah,
It's if you've done everything and everything's good, all your pilot is a rubber stamp of that. So whether you brand it as a pilot or you brand it as phase 1 of your deployment, I think is semantics sometimes. And I think it depends if you're negotiating on the cost piece or not, or what's the break clause out of contract.
Yeah.
But equally, you can do things without pilots. And I think good examples of where you have to is generally upgrades, right? Once your project's live, you don't have the option of turning it off and redeploying it. So you have got to go big bang live. So I think that's all about, for me, how do you protect yourself if you're not doing a pilot? It's really robust testing.
Yeah.
And, I'm retesting fully. So whatever you tested to sign off your go live, is your testing robust? Does it actually replicate end user experience and not just someone spending 10 minutes going, yeah, looks good to me?
I think, that's great SaaS, isn't it, as well, Sarah? When it's a SaaS solution, actually, you're getting the upgrades without even having to think about them, and your customer success manager is just telling you this is part of what you're paying for. It's now live, which is a great part of Road to Geek. So that's a bit of a sale for you, Tom, isn't it?
That test piece, but also making sure you've got hypercare. So if you haven't got with a pilot, making sure that you have got support, and also you've put it live at a sensible time for your business. So often what you get is, we want to go live on a Sunday night, because for suppliers that feels great. For a retailer, That's terrible
Awful.
timing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because you're often signing off payroll and you need all your reporting to run on
Yeah.
a Monday morning. So
Yeah.
really agreeing what are those go live points and what is the hypercare. So how you protect yourself from a worst case scenario of it going wrong and you can
Yeah.
react.
yeah.
And if
definitely.
for me, if I haven't piloted, I always want to have more detailed rollback planning because I
Yeah.
feel it's more likely I might need it.
Yeah. And Jade, a question for you. So how do you approach resistance to change from employees who don't want to change their process or systems? Have you ever had to come across that one?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to then listen to what their feedback is, to try and understand where the resistance comes from. Most of the time, they just need to know what's in it for them and how the system's going to benefit them, and to address those concerns that they have. And I've not in the 15 years that we've been kind of going through implementations, had a situation where we haven't been able to get that employee on board, because 99.9% of the time, it's just a concern they have. They're worried about something. And once you've kind of reassured them, let them know what the outcome is for that, what the solution is, what's in it for them, they're fine to move across. And if they're not, it's probably totally unrelated to the system, and perhaps because they're, an unhappy employee or changing jobs or something along those lines. So yeah, not had a situation where we haven't been able to get someone on board with it.
Good to hear. So I guess that's getting close to the hour. So what's that final thought from each of you on how to avoid these horror stories going forward in your workforce management implementations? Hopefully you probably don't have to do any more because you're already using RotaGeek. But if anyone's not yet on that journey, what are your key takeaways from a key implementation? Tom, should we start with you?
Yeah, I think you can be falling into two horror story brackets. You can be experiencing a bad implementation right now, or you have already experienced a bad implementation. So if we take the angle on the first one, don't suffer in silence. There is a way to salvage a project, whichever stage it's at. So don't make any assumptions that the suppliers are on the same page as you, and make sure that they're aware of your concerns as early as you possibly can. And if they're up to the mark, then they should be able to move quickly and be agile enough in order to take on your concerns and try and get that project back on track. I think if you're in the second bracket where you've had a bad one, and it does happen, it's really important to take the learnings from that bad experience and what could you then remember to do the next time that project comes along. Because there will be multiple projects for different businesses for certain things, but you can take a lot of similarities for that when implementing any project. So I think take stock, take note, and try and not let the same things happen again. Hopefully a supplier will come to you proactively and prepare you for implementation accordingly so that these sorts of things don't happen. But we always get, you will always get a curveball in implementation that you're not expecting. It's how you react and how you communicate together in order to get to the end goal. That's it.
Amazing. And Sarah, yourself, what's the one takeaway to avoid these horror stories?
Yeah, so mine's probably a build on what Tom said, which is, if you're in a retail or, busy environment, you're doing multiple implementations, right? Because that's the world that we now live in. And so I think from a colleague perspective, if you're repeating the mistakes that you made with the last implementation, even if it was from a different system, you're just showing them that you don't really care about their experience. And I think so that, always investing the time in the lessons learned, even for ones that went well, so you know what to repeat, or if it's gone badly, what not to repeat, what to do differently. But I think there's nothing worse than a colleague going, oh, here we go again. I fed back and they just completely ignored me. They've got to do with that feedback and putting them through the same pain again and again. So yes. I think you can learn from other projects, even if they're a totally different solution and nothing to do with workforce management, because 90% of change is change.
It is, yeah, very true, isn't it? And Jade, finish on yourself. What do you do to avoid any horror stories going forward?
I think weekly check-in with your supplier and a weekly wrap-up with the projects team. I think anything less than a week is probably not enough time. And that, for us in our most recent implementation, which was probably our most successful as well because of lessons learned, that weekly wrap-up and check-in was absolutely invaluable. During the week when you're trying to action things and a problem crops up, instead of getting distracted and concerned about that, you bump that into the weekly wrap up or the weekly check-in, and then you move on and you're still being productive the rest of time. So yeah, weekly check-ins and wrap up, I think, were probably the most important thing to us.
Yeah, and that hypercare piece seems to be a bit of a buzzword, but so important now, doesn't it? That actually the supplier is giving you that real important attention and that go live point, and actually you as a business are thinking about what else do we need to do to actually set this off into the sunset and be happy for a project as it goes. Well, we're a minute late, so I appreciate everyone sticking around for an extra couple of minutes who's watching. We didn't get to a handful of questions, so there are still 6 unanswered questions. So I'm sure Steph, Tom will get them out to the panel and we shall get back to you with those answers. So apologies, we're out of time for that. I'd like to thank the panelists for their time. So as Sarah said, important to thank you. So thank you for your input. You can find all of us, I'm sure, very difficultly on LinkedIn if you have direct questions. So direct them first at Tom and then the rest of us afterwards. But yeah, I hope there was some good learnings from there and it wasn't too many scary horror stories. So I hope you have a good rest of Halloween. Make sure you turn off the doorbell and enjoy the rest of your days.